Welcome to this installment of Clarifying Tax Situations with attorney and CPA David W. Klossing.
Hi, I'm Dave Klossing. Thank you for joining me for this segment on why tax crimes are likely to come bubbling up out of a divorce scenario. If you have been committing tax crimes with your spouse or without your spouse's knowledge, it's very likely that those tax crimes are going to come bubbling up to the surface during a divorce, and I'm going to explain to you why. Bottom line is, if you've had this problem, if you've been cheating on your taxes and those numbers are large, you might want to see someone like me before you even walk in and see your divorce attorney. Your divorce attorney is going to want to move the matter through. Most of them aren't very sensitive to underlying tax fraud. They'll tell you things like, oh, I deal with this all the time, and the divorce court doesn't make anything of it. Frankly, their self-interest is to move the divorce forward and make their living. Your self-interest should be preserving your liberty and making sure you don't go to jail for the tax crimes you committed in the past. And I'm going to provide you with methods to clean that up, get right with the government, and not have any drama during your divorce. Okay? So why is tax fraud so likely to come bubbling up to the surface during a divorce? Well, first of all, you need to understand that the gross income reported on your tax returns, when you provide those tax returns to the divorce court is going to presume that the income reported on these tax returns is correct, presumptively correct, unless some sort of evidence is put forth to rebut the truthfulness of those returns and indicate that there's a problem. Now, why do you think during a divorce your spouse, may have a reason to point out the previous tax fraud? There's two ways this is going to happen. Either they were holding your hand and they were a co-conspirator along with you and your CPA or your tax advisor, whoever it was, in committing the tax fraud, or they're an innocent spouse, they knew nothing of it, and all they did is sign the tax returns. Believe it or not, in either one of these situations, your tax fraud can come back to haunt you. Number one, if you got an innocent spouse on your hands, a lot of times in high net divorces where this issue comes up a lot, your spouse is going to hire a forensic accountant to go in and look for underreported income, to go in and look for hidden assets, and to make sure that she's getting a fair shake in the divorce. One of the things they're going to spend a lot of times looking at is your income tax returns. If there's fraud on those income tax returns, the forensic accountant's going to find it, and be careful, your spouse's divorce attorney may use that as a sword in a divorce scenario. In other words, sir, give your spouse the settlement she's looking for, give her the spousal support she's looking for, give her the share of the community property asset she's looking for. Otherwise, we're going to make sure you get prosecuted for tax fraud. She's going to claim innocent spouse, and you're going to go to jail. Okay? First of all, I need you to realize that this is an ethical violation on the part of that divorce attorney. They can actually lose their license for it. It's an ethical violation. They could also go to jail for it. That's actually a crime. It's called extortion. Okay, but this stuff still goes on, all right? It might be innuendo. They'll use your fear of being criminally prosecuted to get a lever on you in the divorce, and they may just well extort you. Let me go on and give you some other reasons. First of all, the gross income earned during a marriage is central to a divorce court determining what the alimony is going to be, what the distribution of marital assets are going to be, and what the spousal support determination is going to be. Frankly, most settlements are exactly that. They are the parties getting together and determining how best to divide up the marital assets, how best to provide for marital spousal support, how best to provide for child support. It's a negotiation process. Most of the time, the divorce court isn't stepping in and making that determination. But everything that happens on the record, there's a public record created, and all it takes is somebody to get wind of the fact that tax fraud has gone on. If that winds up in the public record, God knows the IRS has a habit of trolling the divorce court records looking for just these type of scenarios. Again, tax returns can and often will be proven to be unreliable before a divorce court. If evidence is available that a party may have earned more income than was reported on the tax return, that is very relevant to the divorce court. Frankly, even if the divorce court isn't too concerned about you or your spouse, they're going to be worried about your children, okay? There's a standard, at least in California, called the best interest of the child standard, which says the court has to look after the best interest of the child. The child gets to live at the standard of living not only achieved during the marriage, but afterward, okay? If your tax returns don't accurately reflect both income during the marriage, before the marriage, and after the marriage, you can have a problem. This is important for you to note too. There are competing interests at bar here. If you bring in someone like me, my concerns are to make sure that if the pin is out of the hand grenade and the tax bomb is about to blow up, I find a way to slide the pin back in and get you right with the government and remove the risk of criminal prosecution, all right? You need to understand on the other side that while my intention is to limit disclosure of potentially incriminating evidence of tax crimes, we also need accurate information as far as marital asset disclosures go and divorce purposes. That creates a disharmony between the consequences between zealous divorce representation and criminal tax defense. Your divorce attorney may not have the same concerns over this that I would. Make sure you protect yourself and don't just rely on the expertise of a divorce attorney that is not trained in criminal tax controversy, okay? If you have this problem, frankly, the only person who knows you have this problem at the outset of a divorce is you. And by the time everybody else becomes aware of it, it's too late. You need to seek help from someone like me before it blows up in your face. So, what is the common denominator in divorce that makes tax fraud so likely to bubble to the surface? It's that getting the best settlement possible is the goal of a divorce. Let's face it. Your spouse that's been married to you for greater than 10 years in California, there's a presumption in California if the marriage has gone beyond 10 years, it's a long marriage, and that spouse is entitled to half of the community property. They at least want to make sure they get half of the value of the community property. And then they want to make sure they get spousal support if they've been making less money, because the wife or the spouse has the right to continue to live at the standard of living achieved during the marriage. And if you have the male breadwinner that's making $300,000 a year, the female breadwinner that's making $50,000 a year, there's going to be an allocation of, or an order of alimony to support her at the standard of living she became accustomed to during the 10-year marriage. Also, the child gets to maintain that standard of living. The fact of the matter is, when you take and you divide up the income earning capacity of a husband and a wife, and you all of a sudden have duplicated living expenses, nobody can attain the standard of living that was obtained during the marriage. Usually doesn't work out that way. Both parties are going to lose, but through spousal support, child support, and the marital settlement, the divorce court is trying to make everybody kind of on equal footing coming out of the marriage. The kids, the wife, the husband, and the allocation of the marital assets, and the support orders. Again, here's the problem. Why would a spouse use tax fraud as a sword in a divorce? Well, you need to understand that even if her divorce counsel makes it very clear to her, or him, I don't mean to be sexist, this can go either direction, that they shouldn't go throwing around the words tax fraud because of all the negative ramifications I'm going to get into with you shortly. Again, there's a bunch of unintended consequences if a spouse throws out the words tax fraud and open divorce court on the public record, or somebody tries to use the threat of criminal prosecution as a sword to get a better civil suit in a divorce scenario, which is always a possibility, even though it's not kosher. There are attorneys out there all the time that cross the line on a daily basis. I hate to say it, not everybody that is an attorney is a law-abiding person themselves. I hate to say that. There are moral and ethical violations that are done by attorneys all the time. I've seen a lot of them. Believe me, I defend a lot of attorneys for tax crime violations all the time. Matter of fact, they're the worst violators of the tax law as a group, as attorneys. Here's something you need to understand, that a jaded, angry, divorcing informant spouse may actually see the potential to send their spouse to jail for tax fraud as a very big plus. It may initially sound very attractive to that person, and they may think on this all on their own before they've obtained counsel from anybody. All it takes is for them to put forth a whistleblower claim or to lodge a complaint or claim to be an innocent spouse, and we'll get into that later, and this issue is out of the bag for a guy like me has had a chance to fix it. Okay, I'll tell you how I fix it later, but when I go about fixing it, it has to be I'm going to the government to fix the problem before they come to you to force you to fix the problem. What the informant spouse often doesn't realize is that by doing a whistleblower claim or bringing an innocent spouse claim, she could be sparking a criminal investigation and a tax crime prosecution. Okay, well, let's talk about the ramifications if you're criminally prosecuted for a tax crime, or your spouse, vice versa. It hurts both parties. First of all, there's the potential for a huge, I mean huge, depletion of marital assets. When you think about it, if somebody's been committing tax fraud year after year after year after year, first of all, there's an unlimited statute of limitations for tax fraud once tax fraud is discovered. The government can go back to as many tax returns as they want to obtain the tax fraud. Now, there's a difference between obtaining restitution for previous tax fraud and prosecuting tax fraud. To prosecute tax fraud, yes, there's a limitation. There's either a 5 or a 6 year statute of limitation, depending on which federal law they're prosecuting you on, to bring a tax crime. The government can get around that as well. All it takes is an investigator to ask you during a criminal investigation, did you cheat on your 1990 tax return when you claimed a $4,000 net operating loss on your tax return? Was that fraud or was that an actual deduction? If they can later on prove that it was fraud that you claimed that deduction, and yet you told the investigator that it was a true, accurate, and complete deduction, guess what? That is the last criminal act towards tax evasion. And even though we're talking about a 1990 return, that last criminal act took place within the last 6 years. In other words, you just did it, and therefore that's open for prosecution. Now, ordinarily, only 6 years of activity are open for prosecution. They usually don't go back beyond that to prosecute. But again, they can go back to the dawn of time to pick up tax fraud in every year where it's occurred. Now, let me tell you what I've seen in my career. I've seen the government go back as many years into the past as it takes to capture your net worth, the couple's net worth, by looking at sequentially further and further back tax years and establishing tax fraud occurred, at least for civil purposes and for criminal restitution purposes. The bottom line is that the government criminally prosecutes somebody for tax fraud, they want to completely destroy their lives, leave them destitute without a 2 nickels to rub together, to make an example out of that person or that couple so nobody else commits tax fraud. What you also need to understand that if you accuse your spouse of tax fraud or you get accused of tax fraud, your earnings capacity is going to go down drastically. You're going to start spending a whole bunch of time talking to your attorney, talking to your Covell accountant, coming up with substantiation. Just the fact you will stop sleeping at night, your productivity is going to go down. You're going to earn less money while you're facing that criminal prosecution. You're going to be shelling out massive amounts of money to someone like myself to defend you in that criminal prosecution. And guess what? If you actually get accused of a tax fraud, this is what people don't realize. There's zero income while you're incarcerated. There's actually laws that say you can't earn any money while you're incarcerated. To take that a step further, if you have a professional license, if you're a doctor, a lawyer, accountant, any type of professional, if you get convicted of a tax crime, your career can be over. Your governing body, let's take accountants for example. If an accountant gets convicted of tax fraud, in California, the State Board of Accountancy is going to come along, realize that you've committed a crime of moral turpitude by committing tax fraud, and they're going to jerk your license, okay? If you're an attorney, the same thing's going to happen with your state bar. They're going to come along and yank your license to practice law. Your livelihood is at stake. If you're a doctor, you may find out you can't practice as a doctor anymore. It's very, very serious. Being convicted of a tax crime can be a career ender, all right? Here's the last thing I need you to understand. If somebody is telling you, don't worry, you can out your spouse for tax fraud, and if we have to, we'll do an innocent spouse claim, and I'll make sure you don't get criminally prosecuted, think twice before you take that counsel. There is no guarantee that an innocent spouse can actually get a pass on criminal prosecution. If there are badges of fraud that point to the spouse claiming to be an innocent spouse, she can go to jail just as fast as the person she's accusing of committing tax crimes, especially if there's evidence that they've been holding hands committing tax fraud as a couple, and one of them thinks, I'm going to out the other. The testimony of both spouses becomes very relevant in that type of litigation. Again, to make it very simple, the informant spouse may not qualify for innocent spouse treatment if she had, or he had, actual knowledge of the transactions leading to the criminal investigation. They can actually face criminal prosecution themselves and deal with the civil liability and the tax penalties coming out of this, including restitution and interest on the underlying debt themselves. You get hit with just civil penalties alone. The civil fraud penalty is 75% of the tax. If they hit you for $1,000 of tax, you'll pay $1,750 plus interest back to original filing date of the return, even if they just hit you with the civil consequences of the fraud that you participated in.
Thank you so much again for your time and interest in how we may be able to help you. Please don't hesitate to call if something is worrying you. We would be very happy to help. Just call or email for a reduced rate consultation.